The first thing he saw wasn't the blood. It wasn't the torn calico dress, or the way she was collapsed against a fallen cottonwood like a discarded doll. No. The first thing Elias Gray saw, kneeling by the creek in the quiet of a Texas morning, was the brand. It was on the pale skin of her inner thigh, visible through a rip in her skirt. A word burned deep and permanent into her flesh. Seared there with hot iron, a mark of ownership, the kind you'd put on a steer. The word was property. Elias felt the world tilt on its axis. He was a man who'd seen 4 years of war. He'd seen fields of dead men at Shiloh and the frozen hell of Fredericksburg. He thought he'd witnessed the absolute bottom of what one human could do to another. He was wrong. This was something else entirely. Something colder, more deliberate. He found her 20 yards downstream from where he'd stopped to fill his canteen. The sound that drew him wasn't the call of a mockingbird or the rustle of live oak leaves. It was a human sound, a broken sound. She couldn't have been more than 19, with auburn hair that caught the early light like copper wire. When he got closer, her eyes snapped open. They were blue as a winter sky and twice as cold. She scrambled backward, pressing herself against the log. One hand clutched her shoulder, where dark, fresh blood was seeping through the fabric. The other hand desperately tried to pull the torn skirt down, to hide the mark, to hide the shame. "Stay back," she whispered, her voice like sandpaper. "Just stay back." Elias stopped. He raised his hands, slow and peaceful-like. He'd seen that look before. He'd seen it in the eyes of soldiers who'd stared into the abyss for too long. Fear so deep it carved itself right into a person's bones. "I'm not fixing to hurt you, miss," he said, his voice low and steady. "You're bleeding. That needs tending to." She laughed. It was a sharp, ugly sound that didn't belong in the peaceful morning. "Hurt me?" Her gaze went past his shoulder, seeing things that weren't there. "Mister, if you've got any kindness in you at all, you'll just kill me. Make it quick. Don't make it slow, like—" Her words broke off. A shudder ran through her entire body. A cold knot formed in Elias's chest. He'd heard whispers in the war camps, stories about what happened to people caught in the gears of the chaos. Things that made decent men sick to think about. Things that happened in the shadows, far from any battlefield. "Nobody's killing anybody," he said, his voice firm. "Let me look at that shoulder." "No." She pulled her knees up, trying to make herself smaller. "You don't understand. You touch me, you'll see what they did. Then you'll know, and you'll want to finish what they started." "Try me," Elias said. Something in his tone must have broken through the terror. She went still. Elias had learned patience in the war, the kind of patience it takes to wait out enemy fire, to sit quiet in a foxhole while the world screams and explodes around you. He used that patience now, crouching by the creek like a man waiting for a fish to bite. Minutes passed. A red-tailed hawk circled high overhead, its cry echoing off the limestone bluffs. The creek murmured on, carrying last night's rain toward the Guadalupe River. It was a perfect Texas morning, except for the broken woman and the terrible secret she was trying to hide. Finally she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper. "My name's Maeve. Maeve Tucker." Elias touched the brim of his hat. "Elias Gray. Pleased to know you, Miss Tucker." "Don't be," she said, wincing as she shifted against the log. "There's nothing pleasant about knowing me anymore." He moved closer then, slow as molasses in winter. "Let me see that wound, Maeve. I've got clean bandages in my saddlebags." She stared at him for a long moment. He saw a war happening in those winter blue eyes. A war between years of learned terror and a tiny flickering spark of something else. Hope, maybe. Moving like every muscle screamed in protest, she let her hand fall away from her shoulder. The fabric was torn raggedly. He could see the furrow where a bullet had creased her skin. It was deep enough to bleed bad, but not deep enough to kill. Not if it was kept clean. "Bullet just kissed you," he said, trying to keep his voice light. "Lucky." The word came out of her mouth like poison. "Lucky. That's me, all right. Lucky Maeve Tucker." As Elias carefully cleaned the wound with water from his canteen, he noticed other things. Faded bruises, yellow-green against her pale skin. a split lip that had healed crooked. These were old wounds, stories of a life he couldn't begin to imagine. He worked in silence, tearing a clean strip from his own shirt to make a temporary bandage. When he reached for his saddlebags to get the proper dressings, she flinched. "My horse is just over that rise," he said gently. "Won't be but a minute." He came back with bandages and a small tin of salve. As he knelt to dress the wound properly, the torn fabric of her skirt shifted again, and there it was, plain as day in the morning light. Property. His hands went still. The air left his lungs. In 4 years of war, he had seen men burned, shot, and broken. He'd seen them starve. He thought he'd seen the peak of human cruelty. But this, branding a woman like she was nothing more than a piece of livestock, this was a different kind of evil. This was a quiet, methodical, soul-crushing kind of evil. Maeve saw where he was looking. She jerked the fabric down, her face going white as creek foam. "Now you know," she whispered, her voice hollow. "Now you see what I am." Elias sat back on his heels. His jaw worked, grinding his teeth together. He felt something hot and violent rise in his chest. The same feeling he'd had at Shiloh when Confederate artillery cut his regiment to ribbons. But this wasn't an enemy soldier he wanted to hurt. This was something worse. This was for the men who'd done this. Men who'd forgotten what it meant to be human. He finally found his voice. It was rough, like gravel. "I see what they did to you, Maeve, not what you are." The tears came then. They were silent and steady, carving clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She covered her face with both hands and her shoulders shook with sobs that made no sound. "They had a place," she said, her voice muffled by her fingers. "Called it a stockyard, but it wasn't for cattle. It was for women. Women who couldn't pay debts, or whose men ran off, or who just got unlucky when the war came through." She couldn't finish. She didn't have to. Elias's mind filled in the blanks, and what it imagined made him feel sick to his stomach. "How'd you get out?" he asked, his voice tight. She lowered her hands. Her eyes were distant, seeing a memory he was glad he couldn't share. "Fire. The place caught fire 2 weeks back. A guard, the one who was supposed to be watching me, he was too busy saving his own skin. So I ran." She looked down at her torn dress, her muddy feet. "Been running ever since." Elias stood up. He offered her his hand. "Well," he said, his voice softer than he thought possible, "you can stop running now." She stared at his outstretched palm like it was a coiled snake. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Men like that, they don't just let their property walk away. They'll come looking for me." Elias didn't pull his hand back. He kept it steady, rock solid. "Let 'em look," he said. "They'll find me instead." For the first time since he'd found her, something shifted in Maeve's face. It wasn't trust. Not yet. That would take a long, long time. But maybe, just maybe, it was the faintest possibility of it. She took his hand. Her fingers were cold and thin, but her grip was surprisingly firm. A survivor's grip. He helped her to her feet, steadying her as she swayed from the blood loss. "I got a cabin about 2 miles from here," he said. "Nothing fancy, but it's got 4 walls, a roof, and a door that bars from the inside. You can rest there while that shoulder heals." She looked at him, her blue eyes searching his face for the trick. The angle. The price. "Why?" The question was sharp, suspicious. "Why would you help me? What do you want?" Elias thought about that as he whistled for his horse, a sturdy bay mare named Ruth. He thought about the empty cabin he'd built with his own 2 hands after mustering out of the army. He thought about the long nights when the silence was so heavy it felt like a stone on his chest. "Maybe I'm tired of being alone," he said as Ruth came picking her way through the brush. "Maybe you are too." He helped Maeve onto the horse, then swung up behind her. She held herself rigid at first, every muscle tensed, ready to bolt. But as they rode through the morning shadows, following deer trails and creek beds toward the hidden valley where he'd made his home, he felt some of that tension ease. Just a little. His cabin sat in a small clearing, ringed by cedar and oak. It was built low and solid, braced against the Texas wind. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the stone chimney. It's not much, Elias said as he helped her down. She stood in his dooryard, taking it all in. The small vegetable garden, the split rail fence, the water barrel catching rain from the eaves. It's peaceful, she said. And the way she said it, it sounded like the finest compliment in the world. Inside, the cabin was spare but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood nearby. A bed in the corner, a shelf for his few books, and pegs on the wall for his rifle and coat. You can have the bed, Elias said. I'll make do with blankets by the fire. Maeve turned to look at him. For the first time, her expression held something other than fear. It was confusion. Like kindness was a language she'd forgotten how to speak. I don't understand you, she said. Nothing to understand. Elias stirred the coals in the fireplace, adding kindling until flames caught and danced. You're hurt and you're scared, and you've got nowhere else to go. I've got space and food and time. Seems simple enough. But as he watched her settle gingerly into one of his chairs, her hand unconsciously smoothing down her skirt to hide the brand on her thigh, Elias knew. Nothing about this was going to be simple at all. The first 3 days passed like a careful dance between 2 wounded animals. Elias went about his routines, checking his snares, tending his garden, mending harness leather. Maeve just sat by the window. She watched him with the wariness of someone who'd learned the hard way, that kindness always came with a price. She barely spoke. She'd nod when he offered her coffee or beans. She'd shake her head when he asked if she needed anything. Her shoulder was healing clean. The angry red of the wound was fading to pink. But Elias could see other wounds, the ones that ran deeper than flesh and bone. On the 4th morning, he found her standing by the small, cracked-looking glass he'd hung near the wash basin. She was staring at her reflection like she was looking at a stranger. I used to have longer hair, she said, without turning around. It was the most words she'd strung together since telling him her name. Elias paused in the doorway, a bucket of fresh water in his hands. Grows back. They cut it off, she said. Her fingers touched the ragged ends that barely reached her shoulders. First thing they did. Said long hair was vanity, and vanity had to be beaten out of us. She turned from the mirror. He saw something raw and unguarded in her eyes. You got scissors? I do, he said carefully. Why? Tired of looking like something the cat dragged in, she said, managing a ghost of a smile. Want to cut it proper, clean-like. Elias set the water bucket down and fetched his shaving kit. Inside was a small, sharp pair of scissors. You sure about this? Maeve nodded and settled into the chair by the fire. Been thinking. I might try to look like myself again. See if there's anything left worth looking at. Working as carefully as a town barber, Elias trimmed her hair. He evened out the ragged edges, shaping it until it fell in neat auburn waves around her face. The firelight caught the golden strands that had been dulled by dirt and neglect. When he finished, she looked younger. The sharp, haunted angles of her face seemed to soften. Better? She asked, touching the newly trimmed ends. You look like a person again, Elias said, and immediately wished he could take the words back. But she understood. I know what you mean. Maeve stood and walked back to the cracked mirror. She studied her reflection for a long time. They tried to make us forget we were people, she said, her voice flat. Made us answer to numbers instead of names. Fed us slop from a trough like we were animals. She traced a finger along her jawline. Some of the women, after a while, they started to believe it, started thinking maybe that's all they really were. Elias gathered the fallen hair from the floor. He tossed it into the fire, watching it curl and vanish in the flames. What kept you from believing it? He asked. She was quiet for so long he thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was a fierce whisper. Anger. Pure, stubborn anger. Every time they tried to break me, something inside me just got madder. I figured if I was going to die in that place, I'd die knowing I was still Maeve Tucker, not just some number branded on a list. And that's when she told him about the fire. It hadn't been an accident. Another girl, one named Sarah, had started it. She'd been there for years, had seen too much, had lost everything. One night she'd whispered a plan to Maeve. A desperate, crazy plan. Sarah created a diversion, setting a fire in the main barracks. She knew she wouldn't make it out. She did it so someone else might have a chance. She looked at me just before, Maeve said, staring into the fire. And she said, "Run, Maeve. Run and don't ever look back. Tell someone. Tell them what he's doing." Then she screamed and the whole world turned into fire and smoke. The guard who was supposed to be watching Maeve's section had panicked. He'd run to save his own skin. And in that moment of chaos, Maeve had slipped through a broken fence. She'd been running ever since, with a dead girl's last words echoing in her head. Tell someone. Elias felt a new level of cold fury settle over him. This wasn't just about a group of cruel men. This was an operation, organized, methodical, and at the head of it, a man whose name Maeve had only heard whispered in fear. A man named Jonah Bixley. The name meant nothing to Elias. Not yet. That evening, as rain drummed against the cabin roof, they ate supper in a different kind of silence. Not fearful anymore. Companionable. "You got any family?" she asked. "Had a brother, Daniel," Elias said, pushing beans around on his plate. "Lost him at Fredericksburg. Parents were gone before that." "I'm sorry. Long time ago now." He looked up at her. "What about you?" Maeve's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "Parents. A small farm outside Austin. Yankees came through in '63. Burned the place. Pa tried to stop them." Her voice went flat. "Ma lasted the winter, but the grief took her come spring." "Is that when you ended up at that place?" "No." She set her fork down, her appetite gone. "Went to Austin. Tried to find work. Met a man. A helpful man. Said he had a business. Offered me a job to pay off my parents' debts. The debts for the doctor. The funeral." Elias didn't have to ask who the man was. "By the time I figured out what kind of business he was running," she said, her voice hollow, "it was too late." The rain fell harder, a relentless drumming against the roof. The world felt small, just the two of them in the circle of lamplight, surrounded by a vast, dangerous darkness. "Tomorrow," Elias said, changing the subject, "I'll ride into Bandera. Need supplies. Proper medicine for that shoulder. And some cloth. For a dress." Her head snapped up. "You can't. What if someone recognizes me? What if they've put out word?" "Nobody's going to recognize you," he said gently. "Your hair's different. You'll be clean. Besides, Bandera's a nothing town. They won't be looking for you there." "You don't know these men," she insisted, fear creeping back into her voice. "They have connections everywhere. People who owe them. People who are scared of them. They offer rewards for runaway property." The word hung in the air like a sickness. "Then we'll be careful." Elias reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Her fingers were still cold. Always cold. "You can't hide in this cabin forever, Maeve. Sooner or later, you've got to step back into the world." She stared down at his hand, then back up at his face. "Why are you doing this, really?" He thought about it for a moment. He could have pointed her toward the next town, given her a few dollars, and wished her luck. He could have minded his own business. "Maybe because I know what it's like," he said finally, "to feel like the world's got no place for you anymore. After the war, I came back here, and everything looked the same, but it all felt different, like I was a ghost walking through my own life." He turned her hand over, studying the calluses on her palm. "Maybe we both need to remember what it feels like to be alive again." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull her hand away. "I don't know how," she whispered, "how to be alive again." "We'll figure it out," he said, "together." Later that night, Elias lay by the fire, listening to the rain. Sometime in the small hours, he heard her cry out, a small, sharp sound of distress. He found her sitting bolt upright in bed, staring at nothing, her body rigid with the memory of a nightmare. "I dreamed I was back there," she whispered, wrapping her arms around herself. "I could smell the smoke." Elias went to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked darkness. "I used to dream about the war every night," he said. "Saw my brother getting shot, over and over. Heard artillery in every thunderstorm." He turned back to her. "But dreams fade, Maeve. If you give them time, the real world gets stronger than the nightmares. Eventually." "You believe that?" "I'm starting to," he said. The next morning, the rain had stopped. Sunlight streamed through the window, making the wet world sparkle. Maeve stood in the open doorway, breathing in the clean air. "Smells like growing things," she said. "Spring's coming on strong," Elias agreed. She turned to face him, and for the first time since he'd found her by the creek, she smiled. A real smile. It reached her eyes, and for a moment he saw the young woman she was supposed to be. "Maybe, maybe we could go to Bandera today," she said. "If you still want to." "You sure?" "No," she admitted, the smile still there. "But I'm tired of being scared, tired of hiding. If I'm going to live in this world again, I reckon I better start somewhere." As they prepared to leave, Elias watched her braid her newly trimmed hair. She wore his spare shirt and an old pair of his pants, cinched tight with a rope. She looked small, but she stood tall, determined. They rode out of the hidden valley, leaving its safety behind. The world felt big and dangerous, but for the first time in a long time, for both of them, it also felt full of possibility. He should have known it was too good to be true. Bandera was a handful of dusty buildings, baking in the late morning sun. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, not much else. Elias felt Maeve tense up behind him as they rode down the main street. Her hands gripped his belt so tight he could feel her knuckles through his shirt. He'd given her a spare coat and a hat pulled low, but he could feel her anxiety radiating off her, like heat from a forge. "Easy," he murmured. "Get supplies and we're gone." The general store smelled of leather, tobacco, and kerosene. A woman behind the counter, Mrs. Henderson, gave them a curious look but was polite enough. "Morning, Elias," she said. "What can I get for you?" "Need some iodine and bandages," Elias said, stepping slightly in front of Maeve. "And some cloth, suitable for a dress." Mrs. Henderson gathered the items, stealing glances at Maeve, who stood near the door like a spooked deer ready to bolt. When the woman brought out several bolts of fabric, Maeve surprised them both by stepping forward. "The blue one," she said quietly, touching a bolt of sky-colored cotton printed with tiny white flowers. Mrs. Henderson's expression softened. "Pretty choice. Bring out your eyes." The simple, everyday act of buying things seemed to calm Maeve down. She almost looked relaxed as they loaded their purchases into the saddlebags, and that's when trouble found them. "Well, I'll be damned." The voice was rough, slurred with drink. It came from across the street, from a man stumbling out of the saloon. He was tall and thick-bodied, with greasy hair and the kind of dead eyes Elias had seen too many times before. The man squinted at them, a slow, ugly grin spreading across his face. "Thought I recognized that hair," he called out, his voice carrying across the dusty street. He started walking toward them, unsteady on his feet. Maeve went completely rigid. Her breath hitched. Elias knew in that instant that this wasn't some random drunk. This was one of them. "Silas," Maeve breathed, the name a puff of air, a ghost of a sound. Elias stepped between her and the approaching man. He kept his hand casual-like, resting on the butt of his pistol. "You got business with us, friend?" Elias asked, his voice low and even. The man, Silas, stopped a few feet away. He ignored Elias completely, his eyes locked on Maeve. "So you did make it out," Silas slurred, though his eyes were suddenly sharp, focused. "I heard the screams. I figured the fire took you." "You ran," Maeve said, her voice shaking with a rage Elias had only heard glimpses of before. "You ran and left us all to burn." "Everyone ran," Silas shot back, his voice rising. "What was I supposed to do? Die for Bexley? For that place?" He took another step closer. "Listen to me, girl. He's looking for you. For all of us who got out. He's got men everywhere, offering money." "So that's what this is," Elias said, his hand tightening on his pistol. "You're here for the reward." Silas finally looked at Elias, his eyes full of a desperate, hunted fear. "Reward? You think this is about money?" He laughed, a raw, humorless sound. "There ain't enough money in all of Texas to make me go back to him." "You don't understand. I ain't here to take her back. I'm here to use her." By now people were starting to notice. Men drifted out of the saloon. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway of her store, wringing her hands. The blacksmith stopped his hammering. The whole town was watching. "Use her for what?" Elias demanded. "A deal," Silas shouted, looking wildly from Maeve to Elias. "I know things. I know where he keeps his records. I can give him up to the Rangers. All I need is something to bargain with. Something he wants back real bad. His eyes landed on Maeve again, full of a terrifying, pleading greed. He wants you back more than anyone, girl. You were special to him. If I bring you in, maybe he'll let me live. Maybe he'll give me enough to disappear for good. The air went cold. The unspoken meaning of special hung between them, ugly and venomous. Elias saw the hope that had been so carefully built over the last few days crumble in Maeve's face, replaced by the old familiar horror. That's enough, Elias said, his voice flat as a tombstone. Is it? Silas sneered, emboldened by the audience. What's the matter, farmer? Don't want to know what he did to her in his private office? Don't want to know why she's got that pretty little mark on her leg? The words hit Maeve like a physical blow. She let out a small, choked gasp. Elias didn't think. He just moved. His fist caught Silas square on the jaw. The crack of bone was loud in the sudden silence. The man dropped like a sack of grain, hitting the dirt and not moving. For a heartbeat, the street was still. Then voices erupted all around them. Come on, Elias said, grabbing Maeve's arm. We're leaving. But a big man, the blacksmith, stepped forward to block their path. Hold on there, he said, his voice a low rumble. That man was a drunk, but he said some interesting things. Bixley, reward money. Another man spoke up from the crowd. I've heard that name, Jonah Bexley. Man's got friends in high places, not someone you want to cross. Elias could feel the mood of the town shifting. It wasn't just about money. It was fear. Cold, simple fear. They didn't want Bexley's trouble in their town. And right now Elias and Maeve looked like trouble. Nobody needs to do anything foolish, Elias said, helping Maeve onto their horse. Maybe not, said an older man, a rancher Elias recognized as Samuel Cross. He had a reputation for being a hard but fair man. But maybe we ought to hold this girl. Send word to this Bexley. Let him sort out his own business. You can't, Maeve whispered from behind him, her voice trembling. Please. It ain't personal, ma'am, Cross said, his face grim. It's about keeping the peace. If a man like Bexley thinks this town is hiding his property, he'll bring war down on all of us. She's not property. Elias's voice cut through the air like a whip. She's a person. Look at her. Does she look like something to be bought and sold? Some of the men shuffled uncomfortably, but Cross stood his ground. Looks don't matter, he said. What matters is that a powerful man thinks she belongs to him, and I've got families in this valley to protect. Elias knew he'd lost. He couldn't fight a whole town, not a town motivated by fear. He drew his pistol. Step back, all of you. The sight of the gun made the crowd hesitate. That's all he needed. He spurred Ruth forward, pushing through the men who scrambled to get out of the way. As they galloped out of town, leaving the dust and the fear behind, Samuel Cross's voice followed them. You can't run from a man like that, Gray. He'll find you. He'll find you both. They rode hard, not stopping until the town was long out of sight. They followed deer trails and creek beds, anything to hide their tracks. The sun was setting when they finally stopped in a hidden hollow. Maeve slid off the horse, her body shaking uncontrollably. The hope and courage she'd found that morning were gone, replaced by a bone-deep despair. I'm sorry, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry I brought this on you. This isn't on you, Elias said, his voice rough. He dismounted and went to her, but he didn't touch her. He just stood there, a solid presence in the growing darkness. She looked up at him, her face a mess of tears and dirt. He'll send men. You heard them. They're all afraid of him. I know. Then she told him. She told him everything she knew about Jonah Bixley. He wasn't just some backwoods monster. During the war, he'd been a quartermaster, a man in charge of supplies for the Union Army. He'd built an empire on the war's chaos, selling faulty equipment, shorting rations, and trading on the black market. He dealt in misery, and when the war ended, he just shifted his business, from selling bad rifles to selling people. As she spoke, a cold, sickening dread washed over Elias. He remembered the stories, the whispers of a corrupt quartermaster in the Virginia campaign, a man whose greed had cost good men their lives. He remembered a shipment of rifles that exploded when fired. He remembered a bitter winter when his company nearly starved because their supply wagons never arrived. And he remembered his brother, Daniel, not killed by a Confederate bullet at Fredericksburg, but dead a week later from a festering wound. A wound that the surgeon said would have been fine if they'd only had clean bandages and proper medicine. Supplies that never came. Supplies that had been signed for by Quartermaster Jonah Bixley. The world suddenly became very, very small. This wasn't just Maeve's fight anymore. It had been his fight all along. He just hadn't known it. "He killed my brother," Elias said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Maeve stopped crying. She stared at him, her eyes wide with shock in the dim twilight. "What? This man, Bixley?" Elias felt a rage so cold and pure it was almost calm. "He was my brother's quartermaster. He stole the medical supplies. Daniel, he died because of him." They stood there in the darkness, two people from different worlds bound together by the same monster. The silence stretched out, filled with the ghosts of the past and the terror of the future. Suddenly Ruth, their horse, let out a nervous snort. Her ears swiveled, pointing back the way they had come. Elias heard it too, a faint sound almost lost in the chirping of the crickets, the clink of a horseshoe on stone. Someone was following them, not a posse from the town. This was quiet, stealthy, a single rider, a hunter. "Get behind the rocks," Elias whispered, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. "Now!" He peered through a gap in the boulders. In the faint moonlight, he could see a figure on horseback, moving slowly, methodically, down the trail they had just taken. The rider would stop, dismount, study the ground, and then continue. A professional tracker, Bexley's man. The man was good. Elias had to give him that. He was following a trail that was meant to be impossible to follow, which meant one thing. There would be no running, no hiding, not anymore. The fight was here. The fight was now. The tracker moved like a ghost through the trees. He was patient, methodical, and Elias knew that any mistake would be their last. They were pinned down in the small rocky hollow. The tracker was between them and any chance of escape. "He knows we're here," Elias whispered, his eyes never leaving the shadows. "He's just waiting, trying to spook us into making a move." Maeve huddled behind a large boulder, her face pale in the moonlight. She was terrified, but she wasn't broken. The anger he'd seen in her before was back, burning in her eyes. "What do we do?" she asked. "We wait for him to come to us," Elias said. "He's only one man. The odds are better now than they'll ever be again." The minutes crawled by. The night was alive with sounds. The wind in the trees, the call of a distant owl, the frantic beating of his own heart. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, could be the tracker. Then silence, a deep, unnatural quiet. Elias knew what it meant. The tracker had left his horse. He was on foot now, circling, hunting them. This was a waiting game, a contest of nerves, and Elias had learned to wait in the bloodiest classrooms in the world. He saw a flicker of movement to his left, a shadow detaching itself from another shadow. The tracker was trying to get a better angle, to flank their position. Elias didn't move. He didn't breathe. He waited. The tracker crept closer, moving with an unnerving silence. He was a predator, confident in his skills. He probably thought he was hunting a simple farmer and a scared girl. He was about to find out how wrong he was. The tracker raised his rifle, taking aim at the boulder where Maeve was hiding. He thought he had a clean shot. That was the mistake Elias had been waiting for. Elias fired. The roar of the rifle shattered the night's silence. The tracker grunted, a sound of surprise and pain, and stumbled backward. But he didn't fall. He was tough. He scrambled for cover behind a thick oak tree, firing a wild shot in their direction that whined off the rocks near Elias's head. Now the game had changed. They both knew where the other was. It was a stalemate. But Elias had a plan, a desperate one. "Maeve," he whispered, "I need you to make a sound. Over there, to the right. A cough, a whisper, anything. Just once. Can you do that?" She looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, but she nodded. "When I fire, you run," he said. "Don't look back. Take the horse and ride as fast and as far as you can. No, she said, her voice fierce. I'm not leaving you. That's an order, he hissed. Now get ready. He took a deep breath. He aimed his rifle at the oak tree where the tracker was hiding. Now, Maeve. A small, choked cough came from the rocks to his right. Just as he'd hoped, the tracker fell for it. A muzzle flash bloomed from behind the oak tree. The shot aimed at the source of the sound. In that instant, Elias fired. He heard a cry, a real one this time, and the heavy thud of a body hitting the forest floor. Silence returned, deeper, more final this time. Elias waited. A full minute, 2 minutes, nothing. Slowly, cautiously, he moved from behind the rocks, his rifle ready. The tracker was dead. The bullet had taken him clean through the chest. He lay on his back, his eyes open and staring at the stars he could no longer see. Elias felt no triumph, just a cold, grim emptiness. He had killed again, and he knew it wouldn't be the last time. Maeve emerged from her hiding place, her face ashen. She looked at the dead man, then at Elias. We have to go, she said, her voice shaking, before more of them come. Elias nodded. He knelt beside the tracker, searching his pockets. He wasn't looking for money. He was looking for information. In a saddlebag, he found it. A folded piece of paper. It was a crude map of the area. And in the center of the map, circled in red, was a small clearing in a hidden valley. His cabin. They knew. They'd known where he lived all along. The chase, the tracker. It had all been a game to them, a way to terrorize them, to wear them down, and at the bottom of the map, a single chilling instruction was scrawled. Bring the girl. The man is a message. They weren't just trying to get Maeve back. They were going to make an example out of him, an example to anyone else who might think of defying Jonah Bexley. There was nowhere left to run. We can't go back to the cabin, Maeve said, her voice hollow with despair. They'll be waiting. No, Elias said, his mind racing. They won't, not yet. They'll wait for this man to report back. When he doesn't, they'll send more men. But that gives us time. A little, but maybe enough. Enough for what? To prepare, Elias said, his eyes hard as flint. They want to fight. We'll give them one. But we're going to do it on my terms, on my land. He knew it was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only move they had left. Hiding was no longer an option. It was time to turn the hunted into the hunters. Elias made a decision, a crazy, reckless decision. I'm going back to Bandera, he said. Maeve stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. What? They'll kill you on sight. No, they won't, Elias said, his voice grim. They're scared, not murderous. I need to know what we're up against. Who this Bexley really is. What kind of men he has. Information is the only advantage we've got right now. He left her hidden in the woods, in a place she could watch the trail to the cabin. He gave her his rifle. If you see anyone, he said, his hand on her shoulder, don't be a hero. Just run. Understand? She nodded, her eyes full of a fear that was for him, not for herself. What if you don't come back? I'll come back, he said. That's a promise. The ride to Bandera was tense. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. But when he arrived, the town was quiet. Too quiet. He left Ruth at the edge of town and walked in on foot. He headed for the saloon. That's where a man like Bexley would be, holding court. The saloon was dim and smoky. And there he was. Jonah Bexley wasn't what Elias had expected. He wasn't a scarred brute or a greasy thug. He was tall, well-dressed, with silver gray hair and the smooth, confident air of a politician. He wore a sheriff's star on his vest, but it looked wrong on him. Too clean, too new. He was standing at the bar talking to a group of local men, including the rancher Samuel Cross, and his voice, it was smooth as honey, but with an undertone of pure poison. It's a terrible thing, Bexley was saying, his voice carrying across the quiet room. The breakdown of law and order we've seen since the war. Men taking what isn't theirs. Women forgetting their proper place. He took a sip of whiskey. Why, just last week, I had to track down a young woman who'd been led astray, corrupted by a man with dangerous ideas about freedom. Elias felt his jaw clench. He was twisting the story, painting Maeve as a fool and himself as the hero. This woman, Bexley continued, was legally bound to work off her family's debts, a proper contract, but instead of honoring her obligation, she ran. Now, I'm not an unreasonable man. I understand a young girl can be confused, but the man who is harboring her, well, he is committing a crime. Theft. And theft must be punished. He was good. He was very good. He was turning Maeve's fight for freedom into a simple business dispute, and the men in the room were buying it. Even Cross looked convinced. I'm prepared to offer a reward, Bixley announced to the room. $200 for the recovery of my stolen property and $50 for the man who helped her, dead or alive. A ripple of excitement went through the room. That was a fortune to most of these men. Elias had heard enough. He turned to leave. But as he passed the bar, Bexley's voice stopped him cold. You there? You have the look of a soldier about you? Elias turned slowly. He met Bexley's eyes. They were like chips of ice, cold, calculating, and utterly without soul. I was, Elias said. Union? Bexley asked, a thin smile playing on his lips. Yes. Ah, a fellow veteran, Bexley said, though there was no warmth in it. Then you understand duty. You understand that civilization requires rules, debts that must be paid. He knew. Somehow he knew exactly who Elias was. Depends on the rules, Elias said. Bexley's smile faded. An interesting philosophy. Tell me, friend, what's your name? The entire saloon went silent. Every eye was on him. This was it, the moment of truth. Elias Gray, he said, his voice steady. A murmur ran through the room. Bixley's expression didn't change, but Elias saw a flicker of triumph in his cold eyes. He'd wanted this. He'd wanted the confrontation. Elias Gray, Bexley repeated, savoring the name. The same Elias Gray who was seen in this town just yesterday, traveling with a young woman of particular interest to me. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that everyone could still hear. I know all about you, Mr. Gray. I remember a certain troublemaker from the Virginia campaign. A man who asked too many questions about supply shipments. A man whose brother died because he couldn't keep his mouth shut. The room felt like it was shrinking. The air was thick, heavy. You thought you were a hero then, didn't you? Bexley sneered. Trying to expose me. And look what it got you. A dead brother. And now you're about to make the same mistake all over again. He straightened up, his voice returning to its reasonable, commanding tone. You have 24 hours, Mr. Gray. Return what you've stolen. After that, well, I'm afraid I'll have to exercise my authority as a duly appointed peace officer. And I will make an example of you that this entire territory will never forget. Elias backed toward the door, never taking his eyes off Bexley. You know where to find me, he said. Indeed I do, Bexley said, turning back to the bar as if Elias was nothing more than a minor annoyance. Indeed I do. Elias stepped out into the sunlight, his heart pounding. He retrieved his horse and rode like the devil was chasing him, and in a way he was. He knew what was coming. Bexley wasn't just going to send a few men, he was going to bring an army. He was going to wipe Elias's cabin, and everything in it, off the face of the earth. He found Maeve where he'd left her, her face pale with worry. He's here, Elias said, dismounting, in Bandera. He's turned the whole town against us. He knows about the cabin, and he knows who I am. He told her everything, about the false sheriff's star, the bounty, the way Bexley had twisted the story, and the final, terrible revelation. It was him, Maeve, the man who let my brother die. She listened in silence, her expression hardening with every word. The fear was still there, but it was being forged into something else, something hard and sharp as steel. He's giving us 24 hours, Elias finished. Then he's coming. Then we have to leave, she said. We have to run now. No, Elias said, his voice quiet but absolute. I'm done running from him. My whole life I've been running from what he did. Not anymore. This ends here, in that valley, on my land. You'll be killed, she whispered. Maybe, he admitted. But I won't die in a ditch running. I'll die on my feet, fighting. He looked at her, his eyes full of a fire she'd never seen before. The question is, what will you do? She didn't hesitate. What do we do first? She asked. They spent the rest of the day and into the night preparing for war. It was a fortress, that little cabin, built by a man who knew what it was like to be under siege. The windows had thick wooden shutters that could be barred from the inside. The door was solid oak. Elias had even dug a small hidden cellar, accessible only through a trapdoor under the rug. He cleaned his rifle and his pistol, carefully counting his ammunition. Not enough. Never enough. Maeve worked alongside him. She melted down lead scraps to cast new bullets. She tore the blue cloth they'd bought, the cloth for her new dress, into strips for bandages, a symbol of a future that might never come. How many do you think he'll bring? She asked, her hands busy. More than we can handle, Elias said grimly. But the cabin will even the odds. They'll have to come at us through a narrow clearing. It's a perfect kill zone. The words hung in the air. Kill zone. This was no longer about scaring them off. This was about survival. As darkness fell, a tense quiet settled over the cabin. They had done all they could. Now all that was left was to wait. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. They sat at the rough-hewn table, the lamplight casting long shadows on the walls. In the silence, Elias could hear the ghosts of his past and the terrifying possibilities of his future. He looked at Maeve. She was staring into the flames of the fireplace, her face calm, resolute. The frightened girl he'd found by the creek was gone. In her place was a warrior, a survivor who had been pushed too far. Just after midnight, they heard it, the distant sound of horses. Many horses, moving fast. They're early, Elias muttered, blowing out the lamp. The cabin was plunged into darkness, except for the faint glow from the fireplace. He moved to the window, peering through a small crack in the shutter. He could see them now. A dozen riders, maybe more, their dark shapes stark against the moonlit landscape. They weren't trying to be stealthy. They were coming in force, an army of bullies ready to crush a single man. Back room, Elias whispered to Maeve. Bar the door. Don't come out no matter what you hear. I'm not leaving you, she said, her voice a fierce whisper. You are. He pressed his spare pistol into her hands, the one he'd taken from the dead tracker. If they get past me, use this. Don't let them take you alive. Ever. She clutched the gun, her knuckles white. Elias. I'll come back, he said, kissing her forehead. I promise. Then he turned to face the door. He overturned the heavy oak table, creating a makeshift barricade. He knelt behind it, his rifle steady, and waited. The riders stopped just at the edge of the clearing. Elias Gray, a voice called out. It wasn't Bixley. It was someone else, a man named Wade, his second in command. We know you're in there. Bixley wants the girl. Send her out, and we might let you live. Elias said nothing. He watched as the men dismounted, spreading out to surround the cabin. They were professionals. They moved with a cold, efficient brutality. The attack came without warning. A window exploded inward, and a burning torch was thrown inside. It landed on the bed, and the dry mattress went up in flames instantly. At the same time, heavy boots kicked at the front and back doors. The cabin was filled with smoke and the roar of the fire. Elias fired through the front door. He heard a scream and the thud of a body falling. The back door burst open. A stocky man with a shotgun stood silhouetted against the night sky. Elias rolled sideways as the shotgun boomed, splinters flying from the wall where he'd just been. He came up firing. His bullet caught the shotgunner in the shoulder, spinning him around. Another man appeared in the broken window, pistol in hand. There he is. The shot felt like a red-hot poker being driven into his side. The force of it slammed him against the wall. Pain, white and blinding, flared through him. He slid to the floor, his rifle clattering from his grasp. Through the smoke, he saw Wade step through the shattered doorway, a cruel grin on his face. Well, well, Wade said, kicking Elias's rifle away. The great war hero. Doesn't look like much now, does he? Two other men followed him in. They grabbed Elias, hauling him to his feet. The pain in his side was so intense he could barely breathe. "Where's the girl?" Wade demanded, pressing the barrel of his pistol under Elias's chin. Elias just glared at him, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the man's boots. Wade's grin vanished. He slammed the butt of his pistol into the side of Elias's head. The world exploded in a shower of stars and Elias collapsed, his consciousness wavering. "Search the place!" Wade roared. "Find her!" He heard them kicking in the bedroom door. He heard them shouting. He tried to get up, tried to fight, but his body wouldn't obey. His strength was flowing out of him, pooling on the floorboards of his cabin. Then he heard the one sound he'd been dreading, Maeve's voice. "Leave him alone." She stepped out of the bedroom. She held the pistol in both hands, her aim steady. She wasn't crying. She wasn't pleading. Her eyes were filled with a cold, hard fire. Wade turned, a look of surprise on his face. Then he smiled. "There she is, the $100 prize. You've caused us a lot of trouble, darling." "I said, leave him alone," Maeve repeated, her voice dangerously calm. "You want me? Here I am. Take me and go." "Oh, we'll take you," Wade said. "But first, we have to finish our business with your friend here." He raised his pistol, aiming it at Elias's head. "Can't have word getting around that people can steal from Mr. Bixley and live to tell about it." "Please," Maeve whispered, her composure finally cracking. "Don't. Don't worry, sweetheart," Wade sneered. "We'll make it quick." The shot was deafening in the small cabin, but it didn't come from Wade's gun. It came from Maeve's. The bullet took Wade high in the chest, lifting him off his feet and slamming him into the far wall. He slid to the floor, leaving a dark smear on the wood, his eyes wide with a final, shocked surprise. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the other two men reacted, scrambling for their weapons. Maeve fired again. She missed. One of the men fired back, the bullet splintering the doorframe next to her head. Elias, fueled by a last desperate surge of adrenaline, lunged for Wade's fallen pistol. He got his hands on it just as one of the men took aim at Maeve. Elias's shot was true. The man dropped without a sound. The last man, the shotgunner Elias had wounded earlier, saw it was over. He panicked. He turned and ran, disappearing into the night. Silence, except for the crackle of the fire, which was now consuming half the cabin. Maeve ran to Elias's side. "How bad?" she asked, her hands frantically trying to assess his wounds. "Bad enough," he gasped, the world going gray around the edges. They had won. They had survived the impossible. But as they listened to the sound of the lone survivor's horse galloping away into the darkness, they both knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The man who got away would ride straight to Bexley, and next time, Bexley would come himself, and he would bring hell with him. They didn't make it far. The fire had destroyed the cabin, their sanctuary. They had to run. Maeve managed to get Elias onto Ruth's back, and they rode into the pre-dawn darkness, with the orange glow of their burning home lighting the sky behind them. Elias lasted maybe 2 miles before the blood loss caught up with him. He slumped forward, barely conscious. Maeve found a sheltered spot by a spring, a small hollow surrounded by live oaks. She helped him down, her heart pounding with a cold, sickening fear. The makeshift bandages were soaked through. He was dying. She could see it in the gray, ashen color of his skin. "Have to keep moving," Elias mumbled, his teeth chattering from shock. "You can't," Maeve said, her voice choked with tears. "You're in no condition." "That man, he'll bring Bexley," Elias gasped, leaning heavily against a tree. "They'll find us." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "Leave me, Maeve. Take the horse. You have a chance if you go now. Alone. They want you alive. Me? I'm just an obstacle." "No." The word came out sharp, fierce. "I am not leaving you. I am done running." He coughed and a fleck of blood appeared on his lips. "This isn't the time for heroics." She knelt beside him, cleaning his wounds with the cold spring water. "You said I was stronger than what they did to me," she said, her voice low but steady. "Maybe it's time I proved it." Before he could argue, they heard it. The sound of horses, many horses, moving through the trees, not with stealth, with the arrogant confidence of an army that knows it has already won. Through the trees they saw them, torches like angry fireflies cutting through the darkness. At least a dozen men. "They're here," Maeve whispered. They were surrounded. There was no escape. Jonah Bexley himself stepped into their small clearing. He was immaculate, his fine clothes untouched by the rough terrain. He looked at the scene, the wounded man, the terrified woman, with a look of cold, satisfied amusement. "Well, Mr. Gray," Beaksley said, his voice smooth and polite, "you look unwell. Perhaps you should have accepted my generous offer." Elias tried to stand, but only made it to his knees before collapsing again. Two of Bexley's men immediately trained their rifles on him. Bexley's cold gaze shifted to Maeve. "And Miss Tucker, you have caused me a considerable inconvenience." Maeve rose slowly, her hand moving toward the pistol tucked into her belt. Now, Bexley said, raising a calming hand. "There's no need for dramatics. This is over." "I'm not going back to that place," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. "My dear girl," Bexley said with a patient smile, "you never left. Legally speaking, you remain my property until your debt is satisfied. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." "People aren't property," Elias managed to gasp. Bexley laughed, a dry rustling sound. "Oh, the idealism of a broken man. Tell me, Mr. Gray, what do you call it when someone owes a debt they cannot pay? A debt must be repaid, by any means necessary." "You branded me," Maeve said, her voice filled with a lifetime of rage, "like livestock." "I marked my property to prevent theft," Bexley corrected her calmly, "as any reasonable businessman would do." He stepped closer, his men fanning out around them. "You signed papers, Miss Tucker, or rather, your mother did. On her deathbed, she signed over your services to cover her debts. All perfectly legal." He pulled a folded document from his coat. "She was so grateful for my generosity, to ensure her daughter would be cared for after she was gone." Maeve stared at the papers, her face going white. The world tilted. The monster was wearing the law like a shield. Her own mother, in a moment of desperation, had sold her into slavery. The last foundation of her world crumbled into dust. "Now," Bexley continued, his voice taking on a harder edge, "you have cost me a great deal. The cost of this expedition, compensation for the men Mr. Gray killed. Your debt has increased. I'd estimate you now owe me 15 years of service." 15 years. The number was a death sentence. "However," Bexley said, "I am a reasonable man. Surrender now, cooperate fully, and I will reduce it to a mere 10 years. Refuse." He gestured to the men aiming their rifles at Elias. "Well, then your friend's suffering will be considerable." Maeve looked at Elias. He was bleeding his life away onto the forest floor. She looked at Bexley's cold, triumphant face. She was trapped. Every move she made, every act of defiance only tightened the chains. "What guarantee do I have," she asked, her voice hollow, "that you won't kill him anyway?" "You have my word as a gentleman," Bexley said with a thin smile. Her word wasn't worth the air it was spoken on. "You have 1 minute to decide," Bexley said, pulling out a silver pocket watch. The clearing was silent. Maeve's mind raced. 10 years of hell to save Elias's life. A life he would probably lose anyway from his wounds. Or defiance, in his certain, immediate death. It was an impossible choice. "Time's up," Bexley announced. "Kill him." "Wait!" Maeve cried out. The word was torn from her throat. "I'll go with you." "No," Elias whispered. "Maeve, don't." "I'll go," she repeated louder this time, her eyes locked on Bexley. "But first, I want to say goodbye." Bexley nodded magnanimously. "Of course, a moment of sentiment is perfectly understandable." Maeve knelt beside Elias. To the men watching, it looked like a tender, heartbreaking farewell. She leaned close, her lips near his ear, and she whispered 5 words that changed everything. "Trust me. Aim for the papers." Before he could react, she stood up. She faced Jonah Bexley, her blue eyes blazing with a fire that was hotter than rage. It was the fire of pure, righteous certainty. "You want your property back?" she said, her voice ringing through the clearing. "Come and take it." The pistol was in her hand before anyone could blink, but she didn't aim at Bexley's chest. She aimed at the coat pocket where he'd put the legal papers. The source of his power, the shield he used to justify his evil. She fired. The bullet tore through Bexley's coat, shredding the documents inside. For a split second, everyone froze, stunned by her audacious move. That was the moment Elias had been waiting for. Fueled by her impossible courage, he raised his own pistol. He didn't aim at Bexley. He aimed at the man standing closest to him. One shot, two shots. The man went down. Chaos erupted. Bexley's men, their orders now confused, started firing wildly. Maeve dove for cover behind a massive oak tree. "Take her alive!" Bexley shrieked, clutching his side where the bullet had grazed him. "I want her alive!" But his authority was shattered. His men were hired guns, not loyal soldiers. Their only concern now was their own survival. A bullet splintered the bark next to Maeve's head. Another whined past Elias's ear. They were pinned down, outnumbered, and Elias was fading fast. This was it, the end of the line. They had fought. They had been brave. But it wasn't enough. And then they heard it. The thunder of hoofbeats. A dozen riders, charging into the clearing from the opposite side. But these weren't Bixley's men. At their head rode Samuel Cross, the rancher from Bandera, and his face was a mask of cold fury. "That's far enough, Bexley," Cross roared, his rifle already leveled. "This stops now." Bexley stared in disbelief. "Cross, what is this? I thought we had an agreement." "We did," Cross said, dismounting as his men surrounded the clearing, their guns trained on Bexley's stunned mercenaries. "Our agreement was that I'd help you find your property. I never agreed to help a slaver and a murderer." The hired guns, seeing the odds turn so dramatically against them, threw down their weapons. The fight was over as suddenly as it had begun. "How?" Bixley gasped, his face gray with shock and blood loss. "You talk too much," Cross said, walking toward him. "After you left the saloon, I sent a rider to Austin. Had a friend check on your legal papers. It seems the Texas Rangers have been looking for a man named Jonah Bexley for a long time. For trafficking, fraud, murder." Cross knelt beside Bexley, whose eyes were wide with a final, desperate panic. "It's over," Cross said. He looked over at Maeve, and then at the bleeding man she was kneeling beside. He took off his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice full of a respect that was hard-won, "my son has some medical training from the war. Let's get your man patched up." As Cross's men secured the prisoners and tended to Elias's wounds, Maeve asked the question that was burning in her mind. "Why?" she said to Cross. "In the town, you were going to hand me over to him." The rancher had the decency to look ashamed. "Fear, ma'am. He was a powerful man, and he scared us. But after you left, after we heard what that man Gray said, we started talking. We may be simple country folk, but we know the difference between right and wrong. Some lines, you just don't cross." He looked at Bexley's form, lying broken on the ground. He crossed a line, and we're here to push him back. 6 weeks later, the Texas Hill Country was ablaze with wildflowers. Elias stood on the porch of their newly rebuilt cabin. The people of Bandera, led by Samuel Cross, had helped him raise it again, stronger and better than before. His side still ached, and he'd carry the scars forever, but he was whole. He watched Maeve in the garden they had planted together. She wore a simple dress made from blue flower print cotton. Her hair, now longer, caught the sunlight like spun copper. She looked up and smiled at him. It was a smile so full of life and light it made his heart ache. The nightmares were fading, for both of them. Bexley had died before the Rangers could take him to trial. His organization, built on fear and lies, had crumbled to dust. The other stockyards had been found, the women set free. A darkness had been lifted from the land. Elias reached into his pocket. He pulled out the small, crude ring he'd spent the last month working on. He'd hammered it from the brass casing of the last bullet he'd carried home from the war. He walked down the steps, into the garden, and knelt in the rich soil in front of her. "Maeve Tucker," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm not much. I'm damaged and poor and stubborn, but I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." He held up the ring. "I figured it was time to turn something that was made to take a life into something that could start one." Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling, a radiant, beautiful smile. Yes, she whispered. Yes, you stubborn fool. 1,000 times, yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It wasn't perfect. It was rough and a little uneven, but it was real, and it was theirs. They had been through the fire. They had faced the monster and won. They had taken the ugliest parts of their past and forged them into a future. Their story was a testament to the fact that even in the deepest darkness, a single spark of defiance can light the way home. It's a reminder that you are not what was done to you. You are what you choose to be, and they chose to be free. If you enjoyed this story of survival, courage, and the fight for justice, then you're in the right place. Stories like this, where ordinary people do extraordinary things, are what we're all about. So make sure you hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to turn on notifications because you won't want to miss what we have coming next.